In 2009, the School of Policy Studies was renamed to be Robert Sutherland Hall in honor of Robert Sutherland, the first known university student, graduate, and lawyer of color in Canada, and graduated from Queen's University. This was a huge story and was reported on in the Queen's Journal, media outlets around Kingston, and is cemented in history through the abundance of information available in the archives as well as public information available online, such as in the University Encyclopedia. In the same year, a parallel incident took place that has had next to no press and was covered up by the university. This is the story of the E.A. Collins Room that was formerly in Richardson Hall at Queen's University in Kingston, Ontario.
My name is Gordon Duick. I'm an assistant professor of history and Jewish studies at Queen's University, and I've been teaching here full time about 10 years. I was researching Jewish history at Queen's. So I came across a file called the Jewish Students File. And I got permission, you need the principal's permission to look at it. So I did, and I really had no agenda. I just wanted to see what was in it, because it's pretty striking to have a file that you need permission to see called the Jewish Students File. So I decided I would have a look at it. What I found there was letters relating to a proposed Jewish quota. Queen's has this reputation of being, well, from Alfred Bader's savior, right? And he's a Jewish fellow who came here, was rejected by McGill because of a Jewish quota. So he is known as Queen's greatest benefactor, and it's in part, through gratitude for allowing him, a Jew, to study here without fear of discrimination. What he didn't know behind the scenes was this committee, or the board of trustees, having meetings discussing whether they should have a Jewish quota. They decided not in the end, but simultaneously, as I'm studying the Jewish Students File, there was this committee struck in the early 2000s, which became the Henry Report, and it was about diversity at Queen's and racism at Queen's in the present day. And there was a public meeting that they were holding in Richardson Hall in the room called the Collins Room. And I went, could it possibly be the same guy who was a notorious or noxious, virulent anti-Semite? And I just went to see what was going on. And I thought at a certain point, maybe I could share what I had found. So that's what happened. There was a meeting, the floor was open to the public. I stood up and I read the letter out loud, which I can do now if you want. I read the letter out loud, and then I said, this is the man who wrote the letter. I pointed at the wall, and there was a portrait of E.A. Collins on the wall. And at that point, all hell broke loose. So, dear Principal Wallace, when we were leaving the board meeting on Saturday evening last, Mr. Laird referred to me in a jocular manner as the silent member. I admit that I was silent, due entirely to the fact that I was afraid to speak for fear of saying too much. I referred to the problem which you brought up for discussion regarding the admission of Jews. You will recall that the Chancellor spoke twice on the subject, and I agree with him that something has to be done promptly to prevent being overrun by our friends from Montreal. Mr. Laird mentioned a similar condition in Manitoba University, and although he was very moderate in his remarks, I gather that it is a cause of considerable worry there. In Toronto, the whole area around Spadina and College Streets has been bought up, and they are already beginning to show their numerical strength and flout the law. Individually, they appear quite acceptable, but in the mass, one cannot help but think sometimes that Hitler is right. In 2009 or 2010, I had avoided the press in the meantime, at the time that I had done my little stunt, to show the irony, I suppose, of holding meetings such as this one in a room named after a vicious anti-Semite. I'm not sure if I was trying to prove anything more than that. But to also complicate the narrative of Queens as this bastion of, I don't know, diversity or acceptance, tolerance, etc. during the 40s. But anyway, so I kept my mouth shut afterwards. I got calls from, the press, from the Kingston Whig, Queen's Journal, and I didn't answer any calls. I didn't have job security yet, and I wasn't sure how the university was going to take my revelation, especially since you needed principal's support or approval just to look at the file. Now, lucky for me, the new principal coming in 2009, 2010, was the first Jewish principal of Queens, and my old professor at Dalhousie. That was Daniel Wolf. And I remember one day, I had forgotten all about this, but one day I'm at Matt Corey cafeteria, and he comes up to me and he says, Gord, were you the one who blew the whistle on Collins? And I was like, yeah, I guess I am. He said, well, I went to see that file. I have read the letter. And he said, the next thing he said was, keep this under your hat. It's not the Collins room anymore. That's all I know. He didn't tell me about the process. He didn't tell me who he'd spoken to. He obviously needed to get permission to do this. And I guess, as you point out, there was no major announcement either. It was just quietly changed. And I was never informed of it. I was just told to keep it under my hat, which I did for a number of years, although I told my students. And then recently, I guess 2016, a colleague of mine wrote the third official volume of Queen's University's history, and he put that little incident in a footnote, because apparently there were enough people interested to know what had happened to the Collins room. Yeah.
My name is Daniel Wolf. I've been principal at Queen's since 2009. My role in the unnaming was pretty marginal. I was consulted, but I was not yet principal, and we have one principal at a time. Certainly Principal Williams consulted with me, and I was aware of the issue, and I participated in a call with the Board of Trustees, which is responsible for naming and unnaming things, obviously for continuity, but and I was certainly supportive of the decision. In terms of the renaming, we felt that it had to, the room had to stay unnamed for a little while. And then we had no particular name in mind. And then in 2013, former Chancellor Lougheed died. And it was seen at that point that this would be a good opportunity to honor his memory and put another name on the room. Really, in a sense, that was the final act in the turning of the Collins room, which for 3 or 4 years was simply room 340 Richardson Hall, into the Lougheed room.
At the time, when I stood up in the Collins room and read his letter out loud, there were several responses. One of them was we have to rename the room right now. Like right then and there was a call for that amongst some of the audience. There were older members of faculty who were there who said things like, it was a different time. You shouldn't judge, people by, they're all products of their time. It's interesting that at that time, was it like 2003, 2004? Early 2000s anyway. This conversation was happening uh, it's a conversation that's happening now all over North America. But at the time, I think it was relatively new. At the time, I don't remember anyone changing the name of a bar or a pub because it was named after Sir John A. Macdonald. There weren't statues being pulled down in the southern United States of Confederate generals. And then the accusation of erasing history. Like, that's happening now all the time. At the time, I didn't really know what my opinion was. I did want a conversation, and this young man said, what if we kept the name, kept the room, but also added information next to the portrait? Put some information about, not only his accomplishments and why Queens, relied on him so much, but also the darker side, so that people would know. If you just change the name, he said, and change the name of the room, you are erasing something that might be useful for students to know. So I guess the question is safety more important than information? What do you think?